As we've been talking about why civil war happens and the role of grievances and the role of resources and the role of different risk factors, one thing keeps coming back to the surface, and that is state capacity. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about why I view state capacity as the absolute critical piece for understanding why civil wars occur. And to do that, I want to do a really quick run through of the opportunity theory of civil war that James Farron and David Leighton put forward, or I guess Collier's feasibility version, where he kind of takes their ideas and moves them in a slightly different direction. But the basic argument is that there are these risk factors that are associated with civil war, right? So if you have mountainous terrain, or if your state is undergoing a political transition, those are things that make it more likely that you're going to see a civil war break out. And most of those things we can kind of fit into the idea of resource mobilization theory, right? That mountainous terrain means that there are caves that you can hide in that can be useful, or there's areas beyond state control that you can use for training grounds. But it all comes back to this basic problem: is that nascent rebel groups, which is three or four folks hanging out in a basement talking about overthrowing the state, have a really big barrier to overcome, which is that the state is very easily able to crush them, to arrest them, to kill them with military force. It is really challenging to go from that early sort of stage of speculating about overthrowing the state to being able to actually be a military match for the state where you can hold your own territory. And so what we end up seeing is that when states are strong, those groups get crushed or get arrested very quickly. And you only really see rebellion happening when states are so weak that those groups are able to operate long enough that they're able to gain some momentum and gain some traction and actually be able to challenge the state. Or where those groups are able to be paired with resources that allow them to compensate for the fact that the state is much stronger than them. That might be a foreign patron. It might be, I think in the case of Albania, or of Kosovo, the Albanian state collapsed momentarily and there was a looting of the arsenal, of the armory of the Albanian state. And so there's suddenly an influx of guns into Kosovo that allowed for what had previously been a non-viable military organization to suddenly be able to challenge the Serb state. So it's those resources that end up really mattering. And because grievances are ubiquitous, as we talked about, we don't really need to pay attention to the triggering events that might spark conflict. What we really need is one of those two conditions to be met, right? That the state is really weak and then anything can trigger it, or there's an influx of resources that allow for overcoming the state's advantage. Okay, so if you buy that way of thinking, and I tend to think that that's a good way of thinking about when civil war occurs, then we can go back to some of the other findings that we found that sort of indicated when we see civil war and reinterpret them in terms of how they affect state capacity. And so if we're thinking about GDP per capita as something that reduces the likelihood of civil war, wealthier states are less likely to have civil war, it's worth noting that GDP per capita is really closely correlated with state capacity, with the bureaucratic capacity, with the tax infrastructure, with the ability to provide a justice system that can adjudicate disputes amongst folks. That having state capacity is essentially a necessary condition to have high GDP growth in most situations. The exception being states that have oil wells. They can pull money out of the ground and are able to do that. But that also is part of the story that we'll tell a little bit later on. And so we shouldn't be surprised that rich states are able to smash would-be rebels. They have the capacity to do that above and beyond just being rich. We also can look at Collier's sort of finding that states that are heavily reliant upon commodities are vulnerable to civil war because as commodity prices fluctuate, the ability of the state to pay its soldiers, the ability of the state to finance its operations can all of a sudden be just radically disrupted, right? And so the state might have been fine, and then all of a sudden global oil prices fall, or global grain prices fall, something comes along, and now the state is in absolute crisis and is struggling to pay for their soldiers and struggling to pay for their police force. And suddenly the state capacity in that moment kind of shreds, and that creates that window in which groups can mobilize and push back. We can also talk about sort of political factors that maybe tell us a little bit more about state capacity. And so if we're thinking about rich states tend to have tremendous state capacity. And if those rich states also happen to be democracies, maybe that reduces the grievances available that might be used to sort of foment resistance against the state. But if they're not democracies, right, maybe there's high grievances, but an authoritarian state with high capacity is going to have incredible coercive tools available to crush would-be rebel groups or nascent terrorist groups, or they might just buy them off. One of the things that we see in very wealthy authoritarian states like Saudi Arabia is that sources of resistance to the regime, again, in the case of Saudi Arabia, sort of Islamist clerics, end up getting more or less bought off with a handful of policy concessions and some cash and some foreign policy concessions. That's a viable option in an authoritarian regime, is just to pay people off in a mix of ways. States that have poor state capacity may not be in a position to do that, right? If they're authoritarian regimes, they may not have the ability to just simply crush a movement, and they may not be able to actually deliver on the kind of policy agendas or just out-and-out cash gifts that a source of resistance is demanding. Again, poor democracies might also face that experience where they might lack the state capacity to really do that. And they may also be vulnerable, as Collier notes. Democracy below $4,000 GDP per capita tends to be more prone to civil war than authoritarian regimes at that level of development. And so a lot of the findings that we were seeing earlier in terms of politics, in terms of economics, that were risk factors for civil war really are all kind of pointing us back to this point about state capacity and the ability of a state to crush a nascent rebel group. And this is an observation that was picked up by Anne, I'm blanking on her name, so I'm going to quickly zoom in, Hironaka, sorry Anne, in her book Never Ending Wars. And it's a really interesting book that begins with an observation that after World War II, you see this like run up of civil wars that are occurring and don't really seem to be going away. And why do we keep seeing all these civil wars? And so my first reaction to this was, well, of course we saw all these new civil wars. We saw this run up in the number of states in the international system as decolonization took place and states gained sovereignty. And, there was lots of violence before, but that was considered colonial violence, not civil war violence. And so it's really just a counting measure. But she kind of needles at this point about, well, why is it that those new states were so vulnerable to civil war? And her explanation is, well, those new states tended to be relatively weak on state capacity. And part of that is that the colonial administrations that were put in place were not colonial administrations that were put in place to help effectively rule those territories. They were put in place to help effectively extract resources from those territories. And those new states oftentimes struggled with the ability to govern the territory that they acquired through that process of decolonization. And this isn't a new phenomenon that we would have all these weak states, but Anne highlights how this interacts with a new norm in the international system of non-territorial changes through conquest. And what that means is that in the past, hundreds of years ago, if there were states that were really weak and weren't effectively able to hold their territory, those states would essentially shrink and fall back, and their effective borders would not look like their legal borders. And other states would either move in or leave that territory as ungovernable. And so the fact that we now are in a situation where we don't change borders through conquest means that states that are functioning effectively and have built effective state capacity aren't expanding into those difficult to govern spaces that their neighbors are nominally controlling. And when states essentially accept that they can't rule their full territory, that there are parts beyond what their state capacity can actually provide for, that creates these sort of open spaces where rebel groups can operate and grow and gain capacity. And so Hironaka's essential thesis is that this spike in civil wars that we see in the 20th century is a function of these two processes of decolonization, creating a set of weak states, and a norm of non-conquest, allowing those weak states to continue to exist and hold the territory that they hold in a legal sense, even if they're not able to hold it in a practical sense. And the end result of that is civil war. And so the solution then needs to be focused on building capacity for states so that they can effectively govern their territory. And this has been where a lot of development work has gone in the last 20 years or so, to look at this question of building state capacity, anti-corruption, good governance, and global public goods or regional public goods, to try to create more effective states to govern territory, and therefore create less, or to reduce the amount of ungoverned spaces in which rebel groups can gain traction and then create havoc that further weakens the state, further limits the ability of the state to function and develop, and we get stuck in these sort of vicious cycles. And so the solution has to be state capacity building.